So, Doug, is the outcome of the Ukraine conflict preordained?
Well, gosh, I think that historian's quote probably fits most descriptions of dating. I'm not sure. Not sure it's very illuminating from a military history standpoint. I think it's a huge problem in the United States. One was most battles, and for that matter, wars, are won certainly at least 10 to 20 years before they occur.
Right.
And that's a function of decisions that are made on organization, leadership, training, education, as well as technology, and how well you organize to exploit technology, which is something the U.S. Army does very poorly. The naval and air forces understand that everything for success in their worlds depends upon organizing to exploit technology. The truth is, if you're successful, it's because you've manned it effectively. Right. You've altered your organization for combat in order to exploit technology that's new and different from what you had before.
Right.
The second part of this was what has profoundly changed. And the revolution that I was trying to get people to understand is really this revolution of indirect fire, or what you would call standoff attack, long range strike. There are all sorts of names you can use for it. And how the emergence of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, literally from seabed to space, linked to a whole range of long-range strike systems. And long-range, frankly, to me, as a soldier, means almost anything beyond my line of sight. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the Russians have done very effectively, and it's not surprising since they were the first after World War II to really see this, is that they have organized their ISR and tightly linked it to a whole range of strike systems from automatic mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and so forth, to the point where early in the campaign, there was a fight in and around Kharkov, and an apartment block was abandoned, and the Ukrainians went across the street into a mall and set up essentially artillery and fighting positions. When the word reached the Russians within 7 minutes launched a cruise missile from the Black Sea that targeted and destroyed that mall area with all of the Ukrainians in it. Someone at every level, one person, one man is in command. We don't do that. We have multiple single service headquarters augmented to quote unquote cooperate and be joint. And they all fight over turf, access, their role, leadership, and so forth. One of the things that did not endear me to my superiors was that both during Desert Storm and afterwards when I commanded at Fort Riley, the paradigm I adopted was tactical paradigm, battle drills, formations, and so forth, and integration with air power was really very German. And I effectively abandoned whatever the U.S. Army was preaching, which was never quite clear to me. And as a result, we were successful in the desert in 91. And then the squadron I commanded set a record at the National Training Center, which once again did not endear me to anybody. The air-land battle was really obsolete when it was adopted.
Right.
It was essentially an attempt to replicate what the Germans did in the 1940s. There was some language from Soviet doctrine incorporated into the thing, deep battle, this sort of business. But it really wasn't what we needed at the time, but it was such a breath of fresh air compared with the nonsense that already existed that everybody celebrated it.
Right.
We need a fundamental reexamination of everything, not just in light of what we've seen happen in Ukraine, but you can speak also to this very well. You had access to overhead surveillance and a lot of information that frankly should be available today in most tactical formations.
Right.
There's a way to do that, but we haven't really done it.
Right.
And and one of the things that, well, you're saying that we should be like special operations. You have a battlefield right now where the Russians sitting in southern Ukraine, and keep in mind, they are inching incrementally forward every day. So if you look at the line of contact, 160 miles long, it continues to move north and west, albeit slowly because they're operating in this tremendous sea of mud, which limits your mobility. But you have a situation right now, and I watched this the other day on a video. It was sent to me from Ukraine. And it showed a Ukrainian brigade dismounting to walk across a field, because if you stay on the roads, obviously they're identified. This is roughly about 6 to 10 miles in front of their defensive positions, or at least their perimeter. They identified where they were, and within 2 minutes, they were under effective strike from a variety of systems.
Right.
Again, rocket artillery, tube artillery, and so forth. The entire brigade was annihilated in the space of about 60 seconds.
How do we try to figure things out ahead of time?
I would argue we've never done it. And if you go back to the Second World War, our performance in that war was not some brilliant achievement.
No, I agree.
And I don't blame people like Marshall for that, because he inherited something. He did the best he could. If you go all the way back to MacArthur as Chief of Staff of the Army, he tried to establish a system where he could identify talented officers. He created examinations, study programs. He wanted to turn the Staff College into something akin to the German War College. And he was obstructed throughout the entire time as Chief of Staff. And he was ultimately told, in an army of 250,000 or 70,000, we're lucky to find 20 or 30 officers who are ever going to meet the requirements that you've stipulated, General. And so, he left there. He had trouble just purchasing a couple of tanks for exploratory tactical exercises. So he had a lot of problems. We lost a lot of people as a result of not being adequately trained and prepared. And, if you read it, there's a great book called Advance and Destroy, Patton and the Bulge, by a man named Ricards. And if your readers read that, they'll discover that Patton is always throwing up his hands, because he says, I can't just run around and relieve people. There just aren't that many people who know what they're doing. It's
Right.
not their fault. We have not trained them. They're not educated.
Right.
And I think we have this sort of same complacency affects us now and others. So again, that was another IQ test, but we have nothing on the ground, nothing. And
So-
I think the generals like it that way. I really do, because that allows them to essentially pick and choose whomever they want and make them fellow members of the GO club. Remember, how many times have you heard, well, he's a real war fighter, that guy.
And in the case of Milley, I think he's almost become a Trotskyite. And my question to you is when he talks about white rage, is that because he's got hemorrhoids, or does he actually have a legitimate claim to being a Marxist?
Well, I wouldn't want to guess and confirm the first option. But I suspect that he's just someone who's doing what he's done throughout his career. My experience on active duty taught me that the vast majority of people that are advanced to the rank of general officer are people that are go along, get along people, that question nothing, that simply repeat whatever the boss says, and have this positive attitude that everything can be done, and let's just work ourselves to death some more, and the general will be a success. They ask themselves, well, who's the success story? And if you're a young major who's ambitious, you look up and say, well, who made it to 4 stars? Well, you and I could sit here and say, oh my God, those are some of the worst people I can imagine.
Right.
That's true. But from the standpoint of the major, he says, well, look at you. How far did you get? Why should we listen to you? I mean, listen, this is the sort of thing that goes on.